Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to welcome our speaker for today, David Bellhouse, who will be talking about William Playfair. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube afterwards. My name is Chaitra, and I'm the meeting secretary for the RSS History of Statistics section, and will be chairing today's webinar. And I'll start by giving a short introduction of our speaker. He'll speak, and then we'll do questions at the end, and I'll man the chat, and you can raise your hand and so forth, and we'll go from there. Our speaker today is David Bellhouse, who is Professor Emeritus for the Department of Statistical and Actuarial Sciences at the University of Western Ontario. He received his PhD at the University of Waterloo in 1975. Professor Bellhouse's research areas are the following: history of probability, statistics, and actuarial science, survey sampling design and estimation, and the analysis of complex survey data. His most recent book is The Flawed Genius of William Playfair, the story of the father of statistical graphics. So please join me in welcoming our speaker, David Bellhouse. I'm going to mute myself, and David, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me as well. My talk is based on the book that I recently wrote. The theme of my talk is about assessing data, and it will be illustrated by assessing data that William Playfair collected and displayed during his life, and by assessing published data about Playfair well after his death. So let's start off by going to, of course, the font of all information, Wikipedia. Wikipedia says that Playfair was a Scottish engineer and political economist. He served as secret agent on behalf of Great Britain during its war with France. He was the founder of graphical methods of statistics. He invented several types of diagrams. In 1786, he invented the line, area, and bar chart for economic data, and in 1801, the pie chart and circle graph used to show part-whole relations. As a secret agent, Playfair reported on the French Revolution and organized a clandestine counterfeiting operation in 1793 to collapse the French currency. So I'll talk about his graphical methods, and I will also debunk all this stuff about his being a spy. He was never a spy, and that will be the last part of my talk. So Wikipedia has got it all wrong, and I will talk to you later in the talk about my experience with Wikipedia. So Playfair's graphs all appear in books that he wrote, and he was a very prolific author. His first set of graphs appeared in 1786 in a book called The Commercial and Political Atlas. And what I've outlined here is the key phrase from the title page, by means of stained copperplate charts. That's on the left of the screen. On the right of the screen, I've also circled accompanied with tables and copperplate charts. That was published in a book in 1822, and that was one of his last publications. It was published the year before his death. What he means by stained copperplate charts is color. He was publishing his charts in color, and that was an expensive process in the 18th century and early 19th century. The way that it was typically done was to set up a production line. You would have the chart uncolored. You'd have a number of colorists, each with a separate color, and each one would individually put in their one color, pass it along for the next one to add in. Playfair continued to publish that way, color charts again until the year before his death, 1822. Playfair was not the first to produce a graph. He is the father of statistical graphics, but he was not the first to produce a graph. That's because he invented several new graphs that are used today. He also used most of the graphical elements that are in use in good graphs today. The graph shown here is from a paper by Michael Friendly, who was a historian of graphical methods. The graph shows the rise of the use of graphs in scientific publications from about 1530 to 1960, at which point statistical graphics took off because of the computer revolution. Again, Playfair's graphs appeared between 1786 and 1822. And if you notice from the graph, that's Friendly's graph, that is when the popularity of graphs was on the rise. Friendly has called the years 1840 to 1910 the golden age of statistical graphics. Here's a timeline of Playfair's life and work. He started working for Bolton and Watt in Birmingham in 1777. In 1781, he decided to set up his own shop in London. Just before he ended that work, he published the Commercial and Political Atlas. Then he left for France on a new venture in 1787, just before the Revolution, and came back in 1792, just before the Reign of Terror. In 1792, when he returned to London, he became a very rabid anti-Jacobin propagandist. 1797, he went into partnership with two others to start what was called the Original Security Bank. Same year, he went bankrupt and he went to debtor's prison. 1805 was a very active year for him in a sense. He was sent to jail for a conspiracy. He wrote the first posthumous edition of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and he wrote an insightful book on the decline and fall of wealthy nations. 1808 to 1811, he dabbled in family history, and we'll get into that one in a while. And as usual, with his ineptitude in finance, he bankrupted his publishers. He returned to Paris in 1817, and then returned to London because he slandered someone in France, and returned to London to avoid imprisonment for slander and a fine that he couldn't afford. Playfair was a prolific author and a producer of graphs. And so I've noted in this slide that there's two different aspects to his authorship. One is as an author, and the other is an author by profession. And the dividing line was his bankruptcy in 1797. Before becoming bankrupt, becoming an author or working as an author was, in a sense, a gentleman's profession. People published books to make a name for themselves, to show that they had some expertise in some field. And how this was financed was it was either self-published, self-financed. You could get a patron to finance it. You could sell your book by subscription. And that was about it in terms of getting your work into print. After his bankruptcy, things totally changed because bankruptcy was a colossal tragedy for people at that time. You could go to debtor's prison if you were a bankrupt. You would have a difficult time getting any kind of partner to start up a new business. So there was no way he could start up in business again. So what he had to do was publish books to make a living. And that is known as he became an author by profession. And when that occurred, it was not highly viewed highly by the general public. That authors by profession were looked down upon, whereas authors were looked up to. So he spent the rest of his life as an author by profession and died in poverty in 1823. Here's a list of the graphical elements. that Playfair used and also was the first to use. These appear in a history of data visualization and graphic communication, again by Michael Friendly and his co-author Howard Weiner. The elements include framing the plot and leaving room for labels and axes values. Put in a title, usually outside the frame. Use color coding. Use hasher and stippled dots as a substitute for color. You could label the axes, including the name of the variable and the units. Put in grid lines. Put in time and period indicators that highlight spans of time. And you could put in event markers to put in some historical events that are relevant to the graph. And I don't have many examples or any examples, I guess, of the last one using solid and broken lines to represent theoretical, hypothetical, or projected values. So if you properly apply these graphical elements, you'll get a very pleasing look to your graph, which will then present information easily to the viewer. So Playfair's initial job at Boulton and Watt was as a draftsman. And the picture I've given here is from the Library of Birmingham in their Boulton and Watt collection. This is a picture of some mechanical parts in a barley mill that Playfair drew for Watt. They were making this mill for somebody, and Playfair drew the plans. So if you look at it, there's some of the graphical elements that I've mentioned already. It's framed. There is a title, this time inside the frame. There's stippling at the top. There's hachure on the end parts to show the solidity of the pieces. And I think the stippling would show depth. And then shading, which doesn't normally appear in his graphs, that are on the wheel inside the mechanical device. Now, when you look at this, this is what he did in his work as a draftsman, but he's applied these to his graphs that he used on economic data. And that brings to mind a fellow named Emil Durkheim, who was writing in the early 20th century on how knowledge is created. And it comes by the intersection of the different perspectives and experiences. So for Playfair and data visualization, it combines his work as a draftsman and his interest in economic data and concern for the national debt. And we'll find that through the rest of this talk, Playfair was very concerned about the national debt. One of Playfair's earliest graphical inventions was in the Commercial and Political Atlas, and it's a comparative time series chart. What he's given here, and I use arrows here, he has this is all takes into account all countries. Their imports into England is the bottom line. Exports from England is the top line. And in the middle is the balance of trade. And typically it's in England's favor, but we will find that when we look at the graph carefully, things seem to be nice and smooth up to about 1770. And then there seems to be more volatility in the data. So that's here. And the grid lines get closer together. So the question becomes, we have that the graph is nice and smooth up to about 1770, and then not so smooth after 1770. So did Playfair smooth his data? Did he have some smoothing technique to make the graph look nicer in terms of removing the bumpiness that's there after 1770. I'll get there in a couple of slides, but first I want to look at the issue of graphs versus tables. Oh, I should say also that why is this graph important? The balance of trade in the 18th century and into the 19th century is tied to the gold standard. There was gold flowing into England because of trade, because of this balance of trade. There was gold flowing out of England because of the various wars that were happening during the 18th century, starting with France, then moving to the American Revolution, and then going back to France with the French Revolution. So you see that at the time of the American Revolution, the trade deficit, the trade surplus is starting to get smaller, and later on in the 1780s, it's in a deficit position. So this was an important issue for the day. So now look at the difference between graphs and just the numbers and the data. James Anderson reviewed Playfair's book in a publication called the Monthly Review, and he noticed what we will notice today is that graphs are much easier to follow. They're more pleasing to the eye than just the straight numbers. And so Anderson liked it. A few other people did not, but Anderson liked the fact that Playfair displayed his data in terms of a graph. And you can see the difference. John Holroyd, the Earl of Sheffield, published a few years before, published data on the same issue, imports and exports. And you will notice that he has gone to extremes by giving imports and exports and the balance of trade in terms of pounds, shillings, and pence. So its trends do not leap out at you, and you are not necessarily confused, but you're distracted by all the numbers that are given there, and you don't really see the, without a careful assessment, you don't see the trends in the data. So when Playfair sent his first graph off to James Watt asking for his comments, Watt replied that he needed to include some data with his graphs, and that is what Playfair has done with the large dots. There are the imports in 10-year intervals. The imports yearly intervals are the blue circles. And I got the data from an 18th century publication that gave all of the yearly exports and imports that were recorded in the Custom House records, and did the same thing for exports. So again, the big red dot is that particular year's export number according to Playfair, and the red circles are the yearly data. What I did is smooth the data using low S up to 1770, and then left the data unsmoothed after 1770. And what I got was something that did not exactly fit Playfair's data, but came pretty close. So I take this as evidence that Playfair smoothed the data, smoothed his data, but of course he didn't have a computer and he didn't have low S. So how exactly did he smooth his data? His brother was an architect, I think it was an older brother, was an architect, and would have what's called a draftsman spine, and Playfair also probably had one as a draftsman. These are flexible pieces of wood that you can bend into all kinds of shapes. You tie down with weights, and then you draw the line according to the shape you put down on the piece of paper. Playfair, in the same year, 1786, also invented the bar graph. And this is a case of where um, necessity was the mother of invention. He had yearly data for England from around 1700 to 1780 or 85, but he only had a few years for Scotland. So what he did was he took the most recent year for Scotland and drew bar charts for 1781 showing the imports and exports for various countries. And by looking at just taking a brief look at the bar charts, you can see that um, the biggest trading partners with Scotland are the four bottom ones: Ireland, Russia, America, and the West Indies. And what I've done in the original publication, it doesn't really show up well here, but he had a different shading for the imports and the exports. Here they just look like two black lines. So what I've done is I put in some color. So for example, with Ireland, we have a large amount of exports. A large number for exports is the red, and the blue is imports. So there's a large trade surplus with Ireland. But then if you go to, whoops, hit the wrong button, sorry. If you go to Russia, there is a large trade deficit. So the blue line are imports, the small red line is the exports. I think what was being imported from Russia was fur and timber. The next slide is about the British national debt. The national debt in Britain started in 1688, soon after William and Mary took the throne, and it was to finance the wars against Louis XIV in France. They financed the debt by selling off life annuities. That's how Abraham de Moivre and a number of others made their mark on financial mathematics by evaluating various kinds of life annuities. In this case, what has happened is that throughout the 18th century, they abandoned life annuities and consolidated them all into perpetuities. These were called, if you read Victorian novels, these were called the 3% consols. So on the left, we have Playfair's method of retiring the national debt over about a 75-year period using hachure and stippling. And on the right, you have the same thing in color that he did in 1789 when he got to France. And here's how it works. The line I pointed to is as you retire the debt, and how you do it is use what's called a sinking fund. You put aside money every year. Part of it pays off the interest on the debt. The other part is invested. And typically at that time, I believe they were invested in buying back the 3% consols. So you start buying back the 3% consols and the debt starts to decrease. That's the original debt. But then what happens as you're retiring the original debt, you have a new debt that's starting to grow. That's the arrow that I have here. And then once the original debt is being retired, you're again starting to retire the growth to the debt. And then the last line is again, the debt starts to grow again, and you're retiring that debt. So according to Playfair, it would take about 75 years. Now, as we all know, the British national debt has never disappeared. Neither has the Canadian or the American or various other nations' national debts. I've included this slide to show Playfair's chameleon-like nature. On the left is the balance of trade with India, or with the what he calls the East Indies. And in 1785, he wrote a book under the pseudonym of Albanicus, defending Warren Hastings, who was the Governor General of Bengal. And Hastings had been impeached for corruption. And Playfair then defended him. But the next year, when he put out this chart, he used this chart to show how the East India Company was corrupt, because the amount of trade with India was relatively small, but there were large numbers of East India Company employees coming back very wealthy. Later in 1799, he updated the graph. And so you can see the graph on the left goes at 1780. The graph on the right goes up to about almost 1800, 1799. And the trade deficit is increasing. And the reason for that was that Britain changed the laws on the importation of tea and to stop smuggling. And so the official statistics included more tea imports. Playfair had several highly impractical suggestions for reducing this trade deficit. And I'll just give you one example, which was to require the manufacturers in India to, instead of manufacturing goods in India, to send the raw material to Britain to be manufactured there. Here we get to one of his most famous graphs from the Statistical Breviary. It shows multivariate data. And what I pointed to here is the size of the circle, and this one in particular is for Russia. The size of the circle denotes the size of the country. It's green colored, and part of it saying that it's a maritime power. It's the red part, or the pink part, indicates that it's also a land-based power. Whoops, hit the wrong button again. I'm still hitting the wrong button. Sorry about that. There. The line on the left shows the population. The line on the right shows taxes. And so when you have the slanted line, if it's downward sloping, it's saying there's a large tax burden. And England over here has the slope going the other way. So he's claiming that England had a very high tax burden instead. The next slide is from his 1805 book on the decline and fall of wealthy nations. That shows the blobs are the length and strength of various empires. And so at the bottom in pink are ancient empires. In green at the top are more modern empires. What you have here, again, the length of the blob is the length of time that the empire has been in operation, and the height is the strength of the empire. Playfair was concerned that England was in decline, um, and he had several reasons for that. Um, there was a decline in entrepreneurial spirit. There was an increase in the number of poor, an increase in the widening of the distribution of wealth. National debt was on the increase, and taxes were on the increase. So he used this book and this graph to show his concern about what was happening in Britain. He was a little off base because we're talking about 1805. He didn't take into account the Industrial Revolution and the fact that Britain became much more powerful during the 19th century. Um, the one given here is a pie chart. This is Playfair's. He claims that he invented the pie chart in 1805. It shows the relationship of the parts to the whole. And what you can see here very clearly is in pink are the original states. In green, you find the Louisiana Purchase and the Western territories that had been acquired. And in sort of not off-white, I guess, is Florida. So you can see that the Louisiana Purchase was quite large compared, and the Western territories were quite large in comparison to the rest of the country. But Playfair made some errors. He mixed up, for example, New York and New Jersey. And so he didn't get that quite right. And he also made several other errors, and it follows the dictum of a graph is only as good as the data going into it. And we have to look at where did Playfair get his data from. What I did was I went to an 1805 gazetteer for the United States, and I got the areas of each of the states, and they do not correspond to the numbers that Playfair gives in his graph. So where did his numbers come from? Well, in 1805, he was probably sitting in jail in a debtor's prison. And so he didn't have access to things like American gazetteers. But what he did have access to was a book that had been given to him by Denis Francois Donnan, and it was a reprint in French of his statistical breviary with a number of other bits of information on the United States. And what Donnan had given was the length and breadth of each state. And what Playfair did to get the area was just multiply the two together, the length and the breadth. And he ignored the fact that the states were not rectangular. So what happens when, whoops. Yes, sorry, lost track there for a second. But somebody came into the room. Before the French Revolution, Playfair was in favor of parliamentary reform that would give more power to the manufacturers. Then he went off to France, and he was there during the French Revolution, and he changed his mind. And he decided that the landed classes were the natural ruling class of Britain, and everyone else should be shut out. So what he did to what he called proving that this was the case, that the landed classes were the natural ruling class, is that he gathered information on these landed classes and published the British Family Antiquity, which was a 9-volume tome or set of tomes, basically on a family history of the landed classes. And again, Playfair showed his financial ineptitude by bankrupting his publishers. In the preparation of the book, though, he prepared charts like the one I've given here, showing color coding that in this case, for viscounts who were sitting in the House of Lords representing Irish seats, but were probably all English lords. He's color-coded these to show what kind of service the individual got for getting ennobled. So we had things like green was service to the nation. So if you look at the bottom of the chart, there are all the bishops, the Irish bishops, they're all green. They were appointed by service to the nation. The length of each line is when the length of time that the title had been in existence. And so you had other color coding like yellow for service to the Navy, red for service to the Army, etc. Now, what often happens is that when peace follows war, there is often a depression. And that happened in England after the Napoleonic Wars finished in 1815. And the hardest hit were the workers in the factories, like the cotton mills in Manchester. And these people were starving. Their main staple was bread, and of course, then behind that is wheat. But Playfair argued that no, things were just fine. He totally ignored the working class. And what he did instead was come up with this chart to show that everything was okay. So on the top, the bar graph at the top is the average price of wheat for 5-year intervals. And as you can see from the graph, it increases back in the 16th century, levels off in the 17th, decreases in the first part of the 18th century, and then takes off again in the late 18th century, and especially in the 19th century. So Playfair then argued that this was just fine because he looked at the wages of a skilled artisan. He didn't look at the wages of the factory workers, but a skilled artisan, and that is given at the bottom here. And you can see that the wages are generally increasing for the whole time period. So the price of wheat has remained stable, but the wages and when the price of wheat increases, the wages are also increasing dramatically. So Playfair, at the time, there was a movement to repeal the corn laws or the tariffs on wheat. And Playfair then used this chart to argue against it. So it's an example of lies, damn lies, and statistics. Playfair was trying to support the ruling class because they were the people who would benefit from keeping the tariff in place. He then tried to bolster his argument with this graph, and I find this is one of his most confusing graphs. What he has given is the price of a certain quantity of wheat. Then he has also given the number of days' wages in order to buy that quantity of wheat. And he argues that the price in shillings of the quantity of wheat, looking at the blue arrows, the price is increasing, yes, but the number of days to get that wheat in terms of wages, how long you have to work to get that wheat, is decreasing. And what's confusing about this graph is that he has, if you notice, dotted lines for the price of wheat that are hard to see. He has the day's wages in green until the price of wheat is larger than the day's wages, and then he colors it pink. So it's without looking carefully or reading carefully, it's a very hard to follow graph.
Yeah, so no complications.
No, just bring up in a couple of days, I think, it's the best thing.
Yeah.
Is there a problem at the other end?
Thursday.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, lovely.
I think someone might need to mute themselves.
Okay, that's the only problem. I'm not the problem. Okay. This is another example of Playfair's propaganda. He went to France again in 1787 and returned in 1791. And he was concerned about the national debt and how it was bringing England down. And what was bringing England down to start with was, when we look at the national debt, that is paid for, or that is paid by these 3% consuls. And he claimed that the people living off the interest on 3% consuls weren't of any economic benefit to the country. And you can see with this arrow that the debt is increasing, the interest payments are increasing, and so that is a concern to him. When then you go to rental income, that is rents on land, that is also increasing and then peaks in around 1810. But he tried to look at it in terms of net rental income, taking off interest charges and mortgages. And you can see the gap between the top two lines is increasing, and that's because it became easier as the century went on. It became easier to buy land and mortgage it, so you could buy it on credit. So Playfair's concern was, when you get to 1820, is that the net rental income is now less than the interest on the national debt. So income from land is now smaller than income from the national debt. And so what he did was, to make his point even further, he projected what the national debt would be for the next 10 years up to 1830, and projected what the rental income would be. And he had no idea, or he gave no information as how he did the projection, and it was basically all guesswork. But again, it was good propaganda, showing that the difference was on the increase and of concern. So now again, in the last few minutes of my talk, the conspiracy theory about Playfair as a spy. This was espoused by a fellow named Bruce Berkowitz, and I debunked it in my book on Playfair. So the first thing to do is contrast the approaches to the source material. And the story is Playfair met the Earl of Shelburne, who became the Marquis of Lansdowne, and Shelburne gave letters of introduction for Playfair to take to France with him. So Berkowitz says, so that's how Playfair met Lansdowne. William Playfair was John Playfair's brother. John was best friends with Dugald Stewart. Stewart and Benjamin Vaughan became friends when Vaughan attended Edinburgh, and Vaughan was on the lookout for promising thinkers for Lansdowne after the two collaborated on the Treaty of Paris. A circuitous connection, yes, but there's good evidence for all the links. Yeah, there's good evidence for all the links. You're looking at, in this case, 4 degrees of separation. If you look at the adage, which was turned into a film, with 6 degrees of separation, you're connected to everyone in the world. So I looked at it from a different perspective. I looked at source material, and and found that William Playfair met George Dempster, who was a member of Parliament for Perth, where the Playfair family came from. Dempster liked Playfair's first publication and liked and helped with the work on the Commercial and Political Atlas. Playfair and Dempster and Shelburne were parliamentarians and had a mutual interest in reducing the national debt through a sinking fund. And so that, very simply, is how Playfair met Shelburne. Oops, am I going? Yes. The other evidence that Berkowitz presents is 1793, Playfair was a secret agent. As a secret agent, devised a clandestine plan that he presented to Henry Dundas, who was Home Secretary, soon to become Britain's Secretary of State for War. Playfair proposed to fabricate 100 millions of assignats, which was the French currency, and spread them in France by every means in my power. That is a quotation from a manuscript, and I'll get to that manuscript in a second. But when you look at the source material, Dundas papers are at the University of Michigan. There is no mention of Playfair and his possible spy work in the Dundas papers. In the National Archives, where the government papers are held, there is no indication that Playfair was involved with Dundas at all. And the other thing that I did was I contacted the Royal Archives in Windsor, and they looked through a book that listed all of the spies between about where is it? Oh, it's in around 1780 to 1800. And I was told that Playfair is not listed in this book. So Playfair, there's very little evidence that Playfair was a spy. The manuscript that Berkowitz was quoting was probably owned by an MP, and Playfair had sent it to him with the hope that it was passed on. I don't think the MP, his name was Bullock, the MP ever passed it on. It remained with his papers and then was sold to a manuscript collector in the early 19th century. So I don't think the manuscript ever got to Dundas. On the other hand, I went into the British Library and looked at the papers, what's called the Puisset papers. Puisset was a French revolutionary who turned his back on the revolution and went to London and worked for the opposition. And what becomes very obvious with these papers and a few other sources is that there was a forging operation that was organized, but it was by the Royalist émigrés. Started in about 1791, where the Royalist army was stationed. It arrived in London in 1793, when the Royalists were defeated in Europe. And Playfair did act briefly as a courier between William Wyndham, who was financing these French émigrés and the forgers, after one of the major players in the French forging operation, the Comte de Saint-Maurice, died at the Battle of Quiberon. So there is no evidence that Playfair was a spy, but there's lots of evidence that the French Royalist émigrés were forging French money. So to finish, the insights that I gained from this, in terms of data visualization, a graph is only as good as the data going into it. And viewing a graph is often more informative than viewing the raw data. If you get too artistic, like with pie charts, you can detract from or distort the message, and a well-drawn graph can be very persuasive. In terms of conspiracy theories, don't believe everything you read on the internet, including Wikipedia. Educate yourself to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff, which is on the internet. And no matter how important or unimportant the conspiracy theory is, killing it off is not a very easy thing to do. I tried to do that myself by changing the Wikipedia webpage on Playfair, and I was blocked. What I put up on the Wikipedia was taken down within 15 minutes. A colleague tried the same thing. It was also taken down. So it's not easy to get rid of a conspiracy theory. Thank you. Be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, David. I think we have enough people that if you could just write your question in the chat, that might be easier for me to manage. We do have one question already from Diana, and she asks, what about where does Playfair sit in terms of graph and statistics in non-Western cultures?
The only impact he made was in France himself. In non-Western cultures, the impacts would have been by other people who were working in graphs, working on graphs that were picked up in other places. And that would have happened. There were some, I think there were some early Chinese graphs, but I don't know much about them. But Playfair would not have had any influence on that.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? We have a question from Chris. Do you have a view on whether Playfair favored the pie chart or the annual chart? Annular chart.
I think, well, most of his graphs were the annual time series data, but he only had, in terms of the bar charts, he only had a couple of those, and he only had one major pie chart. So it's hard to say what he preferred. He never, when in his writing, he never said that I can recall.
All right, thank you. Oh, I guess
Oh.
He said I'm talking about charts with an annulus.
I'm not sure that he produced one.
Chris, did that answer your question? If you want to clarify, you can unmute yourself, if that would help.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh.
No, that's fine. I had trouble with the system earlier, so I missed the first half hour of your talk, David. I've read your book and Berkowitz's book, and I found yours to be very academic and his to be a little more like a correspondent. In any case, yeah, in the charts that Playfair produced, obviously there's a huge focus on the pie chart because it was the first example. But amongst them are, at least to my knowledge, two that have an annulus, so that the circle is split with a central circle and a band around it.
Oh, that would have been from.
Those are the two ways of dividing the circle into parts.
Right, that would have been in his statistical breviary. And the interesting thing is that people claim that there is a pie chart in the statistical breviary, which is 1801, but Playfair himself claims that he invented the pie chart in 1805. And it's the first, it's on the title page or in the very first few pages of his book on information about the United States. So I don't think he realized in reading what he wrote in 1801 and 1805, I don't think he realized that he had a pie chart, or he downplayed it. because again, in 1805, it says very explicitly that he invented the pie chart and is presenting it there in this book.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions? We have a few minutes remaining. We have one from Kaushik. How to balance arts and science in the charts.
Well, that's Playfair with his examples. He never sat down and gave you the rules, but the rules have been interpreted from the charts that he produced. And so the art is in following the rules of how to do a good graph, and the science is making sure that you got the information correct, I would think. That answer the question?
He says, thanks.
Okay.
Anyone else? Otherwise, we'll wrap up here.
Well, just let me make one comment about Berkowitz's book. He did write in a very informal style, and in parts it reads he makes a lot of claims that are not substantiated with the sources. So I think he was pretty loose with the sources. And when you're loose with the sources, you can get it wrong, and I think he got it wrong.
All right. I think that is, I don't see any more questions. So thank you very much, David, for giving your talk. And I hope everyone has a good rest of their day. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.